Hey guys, tonight we're following a church bell west, from a little Minnesota settlement to a town that did not exist yet. Settle in and get comfortable. Our story opens in 1874 in Walnut Grove, with a farmer holding $3 he'd saved for new boots. His old boots were cracked and thin. He gave the money away anyway. The money bought a church bell. The boots got patched, the bell got hung, and one Sunday sound settled over that grass for good. A man who could not afford leather bought a voice for a town instead, and the town used it every week for years. That trade is real. It happened, and the reason behind it is worth the first hour of our night. Before we walk into it, one quiet minute. The fire can burn low for this part. If these slow histories help with sleep, subscribe, though only if the nights here genuinely earn it. Leave a comment naming the town and the hour where this finds you. Our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, simply scan the QR code on the screen. On a phone, the links rest in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you for staying, and if sleep arrives halfway through, drift off. I will keep watch. The farmer was Charles Ingalls. The $3 were boot money, counted and saved and meant for leather. That winter, the new congregation in Walnut Grove was gathering money for a church bell. A church with no bell had no voice. It could not call a scattered settlement in from the prairie on a Sunday morning. Charles listened to the asking, and he laid his boot money down, all of it. Then he went home and patched the old leather for one more season. He told his family they would hear that bell ringing clear out at the farm. The bell was bought, and it was hung, and it rang. A man who could not afford boots had paid for a voice the whole prairie could hear. Hold on to that trade. This whole night runs on it. A $3 bell against a $3 pair of boots. That was the arithmetic of faith on Plum Creek, and nobody wrote it down as a sacrifice at the time. It was simply what the season asked and what one household decided it could stand. The leather held, the iron rang, and the ringing needed a congregation under it, because a bell with no members is only weather. So the story turns to the people who signed their names. Now, back to the bell, because the bell needs a church, and the church came first. In 1874, the settlers around Walnut Grove organized themselves into the Union Congregational Society. Say that plainly. Before the town had sidewalks, before some families had floors, the settlement had a congregation with a name and a book of members. The church building itself was going up that same year, board by board, on the open ground above Plum Creek, and the bell was installed in its steeple in that same first year. A settlement that measured wealth in seed wheat found the money for all of it. One small gift at a time. $3 here. A day of hauled lumber there. That is how a prairie town built the one room it would share. The society kept its list of members, and the list grew slowly, family by family, the way everything grew out here. None of it happened by itself. Behind the little congregation stood a man who had crossed half the country to reach it. His name was Edwin Alden. He was born in Windsor, Vermont in 1836, and he took his degree at Dartmouth before training for the ministry at a seminary in Bangor, Maine. He was ordained in 1864. 10 years later, this educated New England minister was riding between raw settlements on the Minnesota prairie. He served Walnut Grove whenever his circuit brought him to town. The pulpit he filled there had no salary worth the name and no parsonage waiting. He preached, he moved on, and he came back. The families learned his face the way they learned the seasons, by return. Understand what a circuit rider like Alden actually was, because this is the quiet machine underneath the whole story. Back east, church societies collected money to plant congregations along the new rail lines. They recruited ministers, paid them a thin salary, and sent them west ahead of the towns. That is why a settlement of poor farmers could have regular preaching before it could afford a schoolhouse stove. The system worked the way the railroad worked, by putting the frame up first and trusting the country to fill it. A congregation before a building, a minister before a salary, a bell before new boots. The pattern will follow this family west, and it is worth remembering tonight, because the next place it lands there will be no town at all. Keep the shape of it in mind as the night deepens. A society is organised, a minister is sent, a debt is carried lightly by many hands, and a sound settles over the grass that no single family could have paid for alone. Every piece of that shape is about to be tested again, farther west, in a colder place, with the same 7-year-old girl listening from a different doorway. Picture the congregation that Bell was calling. Not a picture from a painting, but the practical kind. Families arrived by wagon over open grass, because the roads were mostly agreements about where to drive. Children sat through sermons in their one good set of clothes. The women had cooked since before light, so the day could hold still for 2 hours. Church was the one appointment the Prairie kept no matter what the wheat did. It cost almost nothing to attend and everything to build, and the building had been the easy part. Keeping a minister was the hard part. A minister needed a salary, and a salary needed a town, and Walnut Grove in those first years was barely a row of buildings holding hands along the railroad grade, which is why the man in the pulpit mattered so much, and why we should spend a little time with him. Edwin Alden did not have to be there. Hold his life up against the place and the mismatch is almost funny. A Dartmouth man, class of 1859, a seminary graduate from Bangor up in Maine, where ministers were made carefully, like clocks. He was ordained in 1864 in the middle of the war when the country was tearing at its own seams. Vermont had pulpits for a man like that. Boston had pulpits. Instead, 10 years on, he was out where Minnesota ran out of trees, preaching to farmers who paid him mostly in gratitude. Nobody drifts into that life. It is chosen. The Mission Society could recruit a man and pay a thin salary, but it could not make him stay through a grasshopper summer. Alden stayed. He rode his circuit, served the little society at Walnut Grove when his route allowed, and came back season after season. The families out on the claims learned they could count on his return the way they counted on the mail. Almost nothing else out there kept to schedule. Now come to the night the whole settlement remembered. December 19th, 1875, the Sunday before Christmas. The new church was dedicated that evening, and the dedication came with a Christmas tree, which sounds small unless it is the first one that a child has ever seen. The service was conducted by Reverend Cobb, a superintendent of the home mission work, with Alden assisting, which tells its own quiet story. The system that had paid for the church sent its officer to open it, and then there were the gifts. The tree carried candy and a popcorn ball, mittens, a small china box. And for one girl named Laura, there was a fur cape with a muff to match. 8 years old that winter, in a family that patched its boots. The cape and the muff would be remembered in detail for the rest of a very long life. That is what the tree was for. Not the candy itself, but the proof that somebody far away had thought about children they would never meet. It helps to know what year that tree stood in. 1875 was a hungry year in that country. The grasshopper plague had ruined the wheat around Walnut Grove, and ruined it in a way that made the next year frightening before it began. The settlement had watched its cash crop eaten down to the roots. Nobody in that church had money to spare. That is precisely what makes the dedication remarkable. In the middle of ruin, the town still gathered, still hung gifts on a tree, still handed a farm child a fur cape. The generosity had come in from outside through the mission network, from congregations back east that had never seen a grasshopper cloud. The people of Walnut Grove supplied the room and the occasion. Somebody else supplied the plenty. There is no shame in that arrangement. It is simply how the frontier actually worked, and it is the part the pioneer legend usually leaves out. So by the end of 1875, the pattern of this whole story is already assembled, and it is worth laying out its parts while the fire settles. A society organises before it can afford to. A bell arrives because a poor man empties his boot fund. A trained minister rides in from a world away and keeps riding back. And when the worst year comes, boxes and barrels move along the rails from east to west, so that a child in a ruined wheat town holds a fur muff on a December night. None of the people involved would have called it a system. They called it church. But stand back from it and the machinery is plain, Faith out here travelled on the same iron as the freight. That machinery is about to be tested properly, because this family's time in Walnut Grove was running out, and the next place the pattern lands will make Minnesota look settled. Before we leave Minnesota, sit for a moment with the bell itself, because objects keep honest books. A church bell in that decade was foundry work, real bronze or cast steel, ordered from a catalogue and shipped by rail like everything else. It arrived crated, heavier than any single man, and hanging it was a day's careful labour with block and tackle and more advice than help. Once it hung, it changed the settlement's clock. A bell divides a Sunday from the other 6 days. It says that something here is organised, and it says so for miles. For the family out on Plum Creek, the sound arriving for the grass was a receipt. The $3 had become something audible. A man cannot wear a bell on his feet, but he can hear his own decision every Sunday morning for as long as he stays within earshot. Few purchases in any century pay a dividend like that, and the society itself deserves a last look, because its founding paperwork is quietly heroic. Organising a congregation in 1874 meant names in a book. It meant that farmers who measured every hour against the harvest sat in a borrowed room, and elected officers adopted a form of governance and wrote themselves into an institution. The Union Congregational Society was that book. Its members were few and their money was thin, but the organisation was real. Real enough to raise a building within the year. Real enough to hang a bell in its steeple that same season. Institutions on the frontier were spoken into being like this, by a handful of tired people agreeing to be responsible. Nothing about it was grand. Everything about it lasted. Towns that failed left behind wheat prices and grievances. Towns that held left behind books like that one, with the names written in ink that outlived every signer. Every stayer eventually leaves something. The Ingalls family's Minnesota years were drawing down, the way a fire draws down, not with an event, but with a season of less. The wheat had failed too many times to promise anything. The railroad was pushing into Dakota territory and taking the future with it, hiring men, planting town sites, printing maps of places that were still grass. Families followed the work because the work was the only thing moving. When this family went west, they would carry very little. Some tools, some bedding, a fiddle. But they carried the Minnesota pattern with them as surely as any crate. They knew now what a settlement needed first. Not a store, not a courthouse. A room where the scattered could gather, and a voice to call them in. Keep that in mind on the road west, because they were about to arrive somewhere with no rooms at all. One more thread has to travel with them, and it belongs to Alden. The mission field he served was not a single town, but a moving frontier, and the society behind him thought in territories. Superintendents watched the rail lines the way farmers watched weather, assigning ministers ahead of the towns because that was when land was cheap and need was greatest. A man in Alden's position went where the field was opened for him. Keep him in mind, riding his rounds as Minnesota filled in behind him. The frontier he was trained for was sliding west at the speed of track laying, and the society that had sent him east of the settlement line would soon need him west of it. His path and the family's path had crossed at Walnut Grove. The remarkable thing, the thing this whole night turns on, is that the crossing was not finished. Think about what $3 was in that place, in that decade, because the number is easy to hear and hard to feel. It was not pocket change rounded up for a collection plate. It was a considered sum, saved across a season in a household that counted eggs. It was boots, which on a farm are not clothing but equipment, the difference between working a wet field and not working it. Money like that had a dozen prior claims on it. Seed, flour, the doctor, if it came to that. When a man moves a sum like that from his own feet to a steeple, he is not making a donation in the modern sense, a rounding error given painlessly. He is reordering his winter. The household absorbs it in small daily ways, in leather patch twice and stretches of careful walking. Sacrifice on the frontier rarely looked dramatic. It looked like a man deciding to be cold in a specific place so that a town could be loud in a better one. There is one more thing the founding year tells us, if we listen closely. The society organised itself before the building stood, and the building went up in the same season the town itself was going up. Nothing about that order was accidental. A congregation could meet in any room with a stove, and did. What it needed first was not shelter, but standing, the agreed fact of its own existence, officers and members and a name that the mission society back east could write on an envelope. Standing is what brought the help. An organised society could receive a missionary's time and a bell fund, and in due course the boxes that arrived when years turned bad. An unorganised settlement was just scattered need. This is the deepest lesson Walnut Grove taught everyone who later went west from it. Organise first, build second. The order of operations was the whole secret, and it cost nothing but an evening and some ink. Listen to what Sunday actually sounded like, once the bell hung and the society had its room. Strip away the sentiment and listen to the mechanics of it. The bell first, rolling out over open country where sound carries the way it never does among buildings. Then wagons, many wagons, wheel rims on dried ruts, harness leather working, boots on plank steps, the stove ticking as it heated, because the room was warmed for the occasion and not otherwise. A settlement this poor had no organ to open with, so the opening was voices, pitched by whoever could hold a line steadily, everyone else climbing on. Under all of it, quiet, the particular quiet of work animals standing outside untended for 2 hours, which happened one day in 7 and no other. That was the whole architecture of the day. It repeated weekly in ruin years and good ones, and its reliability was the point. The Prairie kept few promises. This one it kept. Set Alden's comfort against his choice one last time, because the contrast is the engine underneath these Minnesota years. In 1859, when he took his Dartmouth degree, the men beside him were headed for settled parishes, for lecture rooms, for the kind of ministry that came with a study and a housekeeper. Bangor finished the polish. The war years made ordination urgent and meaningful. Every step of that path pointed east toward comfort earned. He walked it west instead, into a ministry of distances where the parish was measured in hours of riding and the study was a saddlebag. Nothing in the record says he complained about the trade, and we will not put a feeling in his mouth. The facts are eloquent enough on their own. Educated men were the scarcest resource on the frontier, scarcer than cash, and one of them spent himself on a circuit of wheat towns that could pay him almost nothing. Walnut Grove got years of him. It is worth saying plainly what these church doors mean here. Piety is not the subject, and nothing tonight asks anyone to share the beliefs of the people involved. What the church was, functionally on that frontier, was infrastructure. It was the settlement's meeting room, its news exchange, its insurance against isolation, its one reliable social clock. The women who organised suppers there were running the town's only public kitchen. The men who served as trustees were practising the only local government most of them would ever hold. A child who recited there learned to stand and speak before neighbours, which is its own kind of schooling. Take the theology out entirely and the building still holds the town together, the way a courthouse or a grist mill holds a town together. That is the spirit in which we walk through these doors, and it is the spirit in which the people themselves, practical to the bone, largely used them. The tree of 1875 deserves one more slow look before the act closes, this time from the branches down. Candy in a mosquito net bag, a popcorn ball, mittens in more than one colour, a small china box, the kind made to hold nothing in particular and be precious anyway. And the fur cape with its muff, warm goods of real value, hung on a tree in a wheat town that had just watched its crop eaten to the dirt. Every item on that list was chosen and packed months earlier by strangers, women in Eastern congregations filling boxes for mission churches they would never visit. The gifts were practical, which is its own tenderness. Nobody shipped ornaments to Minnesota. They shipped warmth and small delights, matched roughly to ages, and let the local church sort them onto branches. When the girl in the patched family lifted down that cape, 2 economies touched. One ran on wheat and weather. The other ran on distance and intention. Now weigh the act's two purchases against each other, because they rhyme, and the rhyme is the meaning. A farmer bought a bell with his boot money. Congregations he never met bought a fur cape for his neighbour's child. Neither purchase makes sense as economics. Boots were worth more to a working man than one voice in a steeple. The cape cost Eastern women real money that Eastern charities always had other uses for. Both purchases only make sense as claims, spoken in goods, that the scattered people of a hard country belong to something wider than their own fence lines. That is what the whole apparatus was for when it worked. The society, the circuit, the bell, the boxes. It was a machine for converting small sacrifices into belonging, and in the 70s, in this corner of Minnesota, the machine ran. Hold the warmth of that thought. The next act takes the machine apart, loads it in a wagon, and asks whether it can be rebuilt from nothing. One practical note, so the road ahead is clear, and then we ride. Dakota Territory in the late 1870s was not Minnesota with fewer trees. It was rawer by an order of degree. The railroad was still deciding where towns would be. Land that would become a county seat was unbroken grass with survey stakes in it. There were no churches to attend because there were no settlements to hold them, just camps that moved with the work, and here and there a building the railroad put up for its own purposes. Into exactly that country, the whole Minnesota pattern now travels. A family that had learned what a bell was worth, a missionary system watching the tracks advance, and ahead of both, one railroad house standing alone at a place called Silver Lake, empty through the deep of winter, waiting to become, briefly and improbably, the most important room on that whole raw prairie. Follow the families home from that dedication night at the pace they actually travelled. Lanterns on wagon boxes, teams walking because night driving is walking work. The cold coming down as the excitement burned off. Children packed under quilts with their gifts held inside their coats, where treasures ride. The mittens would be worn tomorrow. The candy would be rationed by mothers with long views. And in one wagon, a girl rode home wearing warmth that had crossed half a country to reach her. Behind them the new church stood dark, its stove dying to warm ash, its bell hanging silent overhead, with all its Sundays still ahead of it. Nights like that are how an institution stops being a project and becomes a fact. Nobody voted on it. It happened on the road home, in the settled feeling that the town now had a centre, and that the centre would be there in the morning. Winter tested every part of the arrangement, and winter is mostly what that country had. Keeping a room warm enough for gathering was itself a weekly economy. Wood hauled and split on Saturday. The stove lit hours ahead by whoever lived nearest, an errand nobody recorded and everybody depended on. Lamp oil for the early dark of December services. Teams blanketed outside in weather that punished standing still. None of that appears on any founding paper, but it was the real dues of membership, paid in chores rather than coin. A congregation is easy to admire on a dedication night, with a tree shining and gifts on the branches. The truer measure is the 11th ordinary Sunday of a hard winter, when the same few households once again hauled the wood, lit the stove and hitched cold harness in the dark, so that the room would be warm when the others came. That measure too this settlement met, and so the first act ends where it began, with the book and the bell, and it is worth one final weighing. The Book of Names made the society real to the world, to the mission office back east, to the law, to itself. The bell made it real to the ear, to the whole valley, one day in 7, paper and sound. Those were the two technologies that organised this frontier, long before courthouses caught up. A family that had stood inside both, that had given boots for one and sat under the other, understood something that cannot be taught from outside. They understood that a town is a decision, renewed weekly, and that the decision needs instruments. Remember the instruments. A list of names. A voice overhead. In the empty country ahead there will be a winter when this family is the only list there is, and the only room, and the story of how that came to be starts now. If tonight finds you half asleep already, here is the shape of what we have so far told small. A bell in a steeple that cost a man his boots, a book of names in a town of maybe a dozen buildings, a minister with a fine education and worn horse gear, a Christmas tree standing in a ruined wheat ear hung with gifts from strangers. Hold those 4 pictures loosely. They are the whole first act of this story, and they are all true, and none of them stays in Minnesota. The rest of our night watches every one of them travel west into Dakota territory and try to happen again in a harder place. The grass out there was taller, the winters were meaner, and the towns were younger than the graves. It is a fine place to let sleep come find us. The wagon is loaded, the fiddle is packed. We go west now. The bell stays behind now. So does Minnesota. In the autumn of 1879, the Ingalls family went west again, following the railroad grade into Dakota territory. They went out past the last post office and the last ploughed field. The road ended at a camp beside a shallow lake, where survey crews were plotting a town that had no name on any map worth buying. Everything the family had practiced in Walnut Grove rode along in the wagon where nobody could see it. The gathering, the giving, the sitting still together on a Sunday morning while wind worked at the door. Lumber stays put, a habit travels. For one whole winter, the nearest finished church stood far away to the east, and the prairie in between was empty of steeples all the way around the horizon. Hold that emptiness in mind as we settle deeper into the night. Into it, on the strangest date the calendar owns, a minister is about to walk. The camp was called Silver Lake. The one solid building on the town site was the surveyor's house, a working office with bunks and a kitchen. There the Ingalls family passed the winter of 1879 and 80. When the survey crews went east for the season, the family stayed on as caretakers of the company's house. That made them the only settled household on the ground where a town was supposed to happen. Then came February of 1880, and February that year had a 29th day. On that leap day, Reverend Edwin Alden, the same home missionary who had ridden circuit into Walnut Grove in the Minnesota years, conducted the first religious services ever held at the Smet town site. He held them in the surveyor's house itself, with Charles and Caroline Ingalls and their daughters in the room. There was no church. There was no town. There was a surveying office with the smell of supper still in it, and a minister who had come out ahead of everything, even the streets. Whoever else wintered within reach of that stove, the sources named the family. The first sermon at Smet was preached in a building the railroad owned, on a date that exists once every 4 years, to a congregation you could seat around a kitchen table. That is not a legend polished for the gift shop. That is what the record preserves. A leap day comes once in 4 years. It is the calendar clearing its throat, a date that most years simply do not have, a day that belongs to no season's routine because routine never gets a chance to form around it. And that is the day the church arrived at Smet, before Smet itself had managed to arrive. Think about the order of those events slowly, the way a drowsy mind likes its facts. The lots were not sold. The streets were stakes in frozen grass. The nearest locomotive was parked somewhere east of the snowdrifts, waiting out the winter. Yet the sermon got there first. In the history of most towns, the founding runs land, then buildings, then people, then, at some respectable distance, a steeple. Out here the sequence ran backward. A congregation the size of one family met in a borrowed front room. The town grew up around that spot afterward, the way a pearl grows around the grain of sand that started it. Every courthouse and grain elevator that would ever stand in Smet was, in a sense, younger than its church. The town never knew a single day of its existence without one. Picture the room, but picture it honestly, because honesty is the house style of this channel and the sources deserve it. They give us a surveying office in winter, they give us the people, and there they stop, so we will not invent an organ, or hymn books, or neat rows of borrowed chairs, and we will not dress the windows with curtains nobody recorded. What the morning certainly had was walls against the wind, a stove doing its patient work, and voices. Alden would have been a familiar face to the family from the Minnesota days, the minister who kept arriving, and now he had arrived again, farther out than ever, past the end of the finished track. A service in a house is a simple machine. Somebody reads, somebody prays, somebody keeps a child still through the long parts. When it ends, the room goes back to being a kitchen and an office, and the only evidence anything happened walks out the door on 2 feet. That was the entire physical plant of religion in that corner of Dakota territory. It fit inside one room, it weighed nothing, and it left no mark the snow could not cover by nightfall. It is fair to wonder what a church even is at that point. Strip away the building, the bell, the pews, the incorporation papers, and the salary, and on that leap day the whole institution came down to one thing. People who did not have to gather gathered. That is the irreducible part, the load-bearing wall of the entire enterprise. Everything else, as Walnut Grove already showed us, is furniture that arrives later on its own schedule by freight. The men who wrote the Mission Society reports back east had a particular word for country like this. They called it a field, not a parish. A parish has edges, a church at the centre, a settled family in every pew. A field is open ground where something might be planted and might take, or might not, depending on whether nobody controls. On the last day of February 1880, the field at Silver Lake got its first seed. Nobody incorporated anything. Nobody signed anything. Winter went on exactly as before, indifferent as ever. But the gathering had happened, and gatherings are the one prairie crop that reseeds itself. Now, a service like that raises a practical puzzle, and the puzzle is worth a drowsy moment because it explains how the whole frontier actually worked. Alden did not preach at Silver Lake because anyone had assigned him there. On that leap day morning, no board back east had to Smet on its books because there was no de Smet to have. The sermon came first, the paperwork came after, trailing along behind the event like a wagon behind a team. To see why that was normal and even wise, we have to look at the machinery behind the man. A quiet system of societies and superintendents kept sending ministers out past the edge of the settled world. The accounts were squared later by mail. Here is the paperwork in its proper place, which is second place. In March of 1880, weeks after that leap day gathering, Edwin Alden was formally appointed Home Missionary for de Smet. The appointment came from Superintendent Stuart Sheldon, the Congregational official who managed the mission fields of the territory. Sheldon's work was to know where the railroad would put towns before the towns existed, and to assign his scattered ministers to match. Read that sequence again, slowly, because it is the hinge of this whole stretch of the story. The first sermon at the town site was preached in February. The minister was assigned to the town site in March. For those first weeks, Alden was a missionary to a place that officially had no mission. Preaching on ground his own superintendent had not yet handed him. A shepherd a few steps ahead of his own credentials. The system was not broken. The system was built this way, loose on purpose. A man on the spot could act first, and the office would catch up to him by mail, at the speed of winter roads. The machinery deserves a plain account, because it built more prairie towns than any land office ever did. Back east sat the home mission societies, boards with ledgers, donors, and maps that were always a season out of date. Out west rode superintendents like Sheldon, crossing the territory the way a foreman crosses a job site, matching ministers to settlements the way a careful farmer matches seed to fields. The ministers themselves were the moving parts. They went where the rails went, and often a little past the rails, into country that was still all survey stakes and rumour. A man like Alden might hold a pulpit in one town, a preaching station in a second, and a promise in a third, all in the same month. Pay was thin, and part of it had to be raised on the spot from people who mostly paid in eggs and gratitude. The reward was arithmetic. One minister, spread across 3 settlements, could keep faith alive in all 3 until each grew strong enough to call a pastor of its own. It was circuit riding turned into a supply chain, tested for half a century before it ever reached Dakota, and by 1880 it ran with the practiced calm of an old railroad timetable. Notice what the reversed order of sermon and appointment says about the frontier itself. Institutions out here did not wait for demand. They anticipated it, the way a good storekeeper stocks winter boots in September. Sheldon and men like him were placing ministers the way the railroad placed depots, ahead of the customers, on the theory that the town would form around the service rather than the service forming around the town. Sometimes the theory failed. A mission station could simply blow away with its settlement, leaving a name in a ledger and nothing on the ground. But when it worked, it meant the very first institution most prairie towns ever had, before the bank, before the school board, before the newspaper with its proud masthead, was a congregation. De Smet fits the pattern to the letter. The town got a sermon before it got a name on a plat, and a designated missionary before it got a store to buy nails in. Faith was not the finishing touch on that town. Faith was the surveyor's first stake. So much for the machinery, with its boards and its mail. Come back inside now, out of the wind, and pull the quilt a little higher, because for that first stretch of 1880 the whole apparatus of organised religion in De Smet still amounted to one thing: a house, the same house, and a house that must be a church on Sunday, while staying a house the other 6 days makes for a particular kind of worship. Humble, improvised, easy to underestimate. It is worth sitting inside for a while before the story moves on. The consequence of that leap day was quiet but real. By holding the first services in the surveyor's house, Alden turned a working railroad building into the settlement's first church room, and the tidy eastern distinction between dwelling and sanctuary simply dissolved on the town site. The record fixes the first service to that single-dated morning, with the Ingalls family present in the room. How often the winter neighbours gathered afterward, in what corner of which room, with what readings and in what order, the sources do not preserve. We will not pretend otherwise. This is a night for being lulled by the truth, not by trimmings. What stands is the precedent, and precedent is the part that matters. From the last day of February onward, worship at De Smet had an address before the town had streets, and the address was somebody's kitchen door. The first church of De Smet was never built. It was borrowed, and it was borrowed from a railroad, which had no idea it was in the sanctuary business at all. Live inside that arrangement for a moment, because it is a gentle thing to imagine. The rooms of the surveyor's house had weekday jobs, plats and level books on the table, kettles on the stove, boots drying by the door, the ordinary clutter of people wintering at the edge of the map. Turning such a place toward worship took about 4 gestures. Clear the table, straighten the chairs, quiet the children, open the book. Afterward the same 4 gestures ran in reverse, and the room forgot the whole affair until the next gathering came around. No steeple announced the place, no bell rang over the lake. A stranger crossing the frozen shallows could have walked within 10 paces of the only church for a great many miles, and seen nothing but lamplight and smoke from a stovepipe. Faith on the town site was, in the most literal sense, indoors. It had no public face at all, and the family keeping that house through the winter was the same family that had helped raise a bell over a Minnesota congregation not 6 years before. They knew exactly what a church with walls of its own sounded like. They may do, without complaint the record cares to preserve, with a church that had only rooms. There is a dignity in that improvisation that a finished sanctuary never quite recovers. When the room is borrowed, everyone in it is a volunteer twice over. They chose to believe, and then they chose to rearrange the furniture about it. Nothing carried the service but the people themselves. Take the people out, and the church did not close the way a shop closes, with a sign and a promise to reopen. It vanished entirely, as if it had never been. That fragility explains why the little gathering mattered so far out of proportion to its size. It was the one institution on the town site that could not run on momentum. A railroad keeps its schedule whether or not anyone is watching the rails. A courthouse stands there being a courthouse all night long. A gathering in a kitchen exists only in the moment of gathering, and every single meeting is a fresh vote to continue, taken without a ballot box, counted in chairs. Through that first spring at the edge of the map, the vote kept passing. Quietly, weakly, so far as we can tell. one warm room at a time. Alden, meanwhile, was still a circuit man with other fields to serve, and the mission system never intended him to stay put. His gift was the seed, not the harvest. The tending would belong to someone else, which was the plan all along. And that handoff brings us to a genuine seam in the story. The old papers, read side by side, refuse to agree with each other, and the margin of their disagreement is 4 whole months. We get to watch, up close, how history behaves when the ink runs thin. Here is the seam, laid out as honestly as we can lay it. Within the very same body of church history, one page reports that Alden relinquished the Smet field to a successor named Edward Brown in May of 1880. Another page of the same material puts that same handoff in September of 1880. May on one page, September on another. 4 months apart, about one small town inside one collection, with no third page to break the tie. And between those 2 candidate months sits a fact that nobody disputes, fixed in June of 1880, which is when Brown formally organised the Congregation. So the paper trail offers us a choice of 2 doorways and 1 solid room between them. We will not pick a doorway, because picking would mean pretending to know something the pages themselves do not agree on. May or September, the truthful statement is exactly this. Sometime in 1880, the man who planted the field passed it to the man who would fence it. The precise month has slipped down through a crack between 2 pages. There it remains to this night. Why would a single collection disagree with itself about its own town by 4 whole months? No scandal is required, and none should be imagined. Frontier ministry generated paper the way it generated everything else, in a hurry, by lamplight, often years after the fact, by tired men doing their honest best between other duties. One entry might date the handoff from the last sermon Alden actually preached on that ground. Another might date it from the moment the mission board's ledger, catching up to the Prairie by mail at its own unhurried speed, finally moved his name from one column to another. Both writers could be honest. Both could be looking at true dates for slightly different events and calling them by the same word. Reports were compiled from memory. Anniversaries were rounded to the nearest season the way flour was measured by the scoop, and the distinction between leaving a field and being recorded as having left it could easily swallow a summer whole. The Prairie made history much faster than it made historians, and the gap between those 2 speeds is exactly 4 months wide on this particular page. Now notice what the ambiguity does not touch, because this is the comfortable part. Whichever month Alden stepped back, the gathering itself never has to be redated. February 29th stands. June stands. The fixed points hold their ground while the connective tissue between them stays soft. That is a healthy way to know a small town. A family album is certain of the weddings while the ordinary Tuesdays blur. It would be easy and false to varnish over the gap and quietly pick the tidier month. The braver move is to keep both dates on the table and admit the seam, because the seam itself is evidence. It tells us that the little congregation at Smet was, for a season, passing between hands, half Alden's planting and half Brown's tending, and that nobody living through it thought the exact baton moment worth writing down. Institutions record their crises with terrible care. Nobody misdates a fire. This handoff was so smooth, so unremarkable to the people inside it, that the paperwork barely bothered to notice it happening. Brown and his June organisation belong to the next stretch of our night. He will get his full introduction there, famous cousin and all, with the depot and the certificate and the winter that stopped the trains. But before the story hands the field over to the new man, it owes Edwin Alden a proper goodbye. Ministers who plant towns almost never get to stay in them. For once, the paper trail is kind, and it tells us exactly where this one went. Alden did not linger at Smet once his part was played, and he did not vanish into the Mission Society's filing cabinets either. His road led on to another small Dakota settlement, a place called Athol, and there the travelling man finally stopped travelling. On May 16th, 1881, he filed a homestead claim of his own, the same paper promise every farmer around him had staked a life on. That same year he became postmaster of Dakota territory, and he took the pulpit as the settlement's pastor, a pulpit he would keep from 1881 all the way to 1896. Hold those numbers a moment, there in the dark. The missionary who had spent years arriving and leaving, put down 15 consecutive years in one tiny place. Claim, mailbag and pulpit, all carried in the same pair of hands, in a town most maps never bothered to print. The man who was always passing through became, at last, the man who was simply there. There is a whole settlement history folded inside that little resume, and it unfolds nicely if we take it one item at a time. A homestead claim meant Alden was now farming the same stubborn prairie as his parishioners, proving up his acres between sermons, learning firsthand the exact weather his congregation prayed about. The postmaster's job meant every letter, newspaper, and mission society draft that reached Athol passed through the minister's own hands. That quietly made the church and the mail one counter. One stove, one line of neighbours waiting and visiting on a cold morning. And the pulpit meant that on Sundays the farmer postmaster stood up in front of the same neighbours and preached. One man, holding 3 of the town's connective institutions at once. It sounds like overreach until we remember the arithmetic of a place like Athol. A settlement that small had only so many literate, steady, publicly trusted adults to spend, and it spent them where it had to, twice and 3 times over. The mission system had trained Alden to be interchangeable. One rider swapped for another. Athol made him the opposite. Athol made him indispensable. Set the 2 halves of the man side by side and let them balance. For years, Alden's ministry was measured in miles. A sermon here, a sermon a long ride farther on, a settlement served in passing, a night in a strange bed, and gone by noon. From 1881 onward it was measured in seasons instead, the same faces aging in the same pews, while the same pastor married them, buried them, and sorted their mail with the frost still on his coat. 15 years is longer than he gave any other place. It is longer than Walnut Grove got from him, and far longer than Smet got, which was measured in months. History tends to remember the planters and forget the tenders, so Smet remembers Alden as a founding visitor, a name on the first page. Athol got everything after the first page. Athol got the rest of him, the whole settled remainder of a restless working life. The man who spent his youth bringing the church to the towns finally let one small town keep him for good. And with Alden settled behind his counter at Athol sorting letters in the lamplight, we can finally stand back and look at the shape of the thing we have been following all night. 2 states, 2 little settlements, 6 years apart. One family present in both rooms, first as newcomers and then as hosts. Lay the 2 beginnings side by side gently, like photographs on a quilt, because seen together they say something that neither one manages to say alone. In Minnesota, the congregation came together first, and the family arrived to find it forming, a society organized in 1874 with a bell already on the way, and neighbors already practiced at passing a plate. In Dakota, the order flipped over completely. The family was already there, wintering alone in the surveyor's house, and the church came out to them. One minister, on one leap day, February 29th, 1880. He held the town site's first services in the room where they ate their supper. Same decade, same denomination, same family in the pews, such as the pews were. But Walnut Grove shows a congregation acquiring a family, and Smet shows a family hosting a congregation. 6 years apart, the 2 scenes are mirror images, and the silvering between them is the family itself. The pattern that travelled west was not an institution with offices and minutes. It was a practice, carried in wagons, patient as seed corn, able to attach itself to whatever room the frontier offered next. Think about what actually made the trip west in that wagon, itemised like freight, not the bell. The bell hung right where the boot money had put it, back in Minnesota, doing its work over other people's mornings. Not the building, obviously, and not the membership rolls which belonged to the society that kept them. What travelled was smaller and lighter than any of that, and could not be taxed or lost in a river crossing. The knowledge of how a Sunday works, how a room is turned quiet, how a scattered handful of households finds a common hour and keeps it, week after week, without anyone making them and without any wage attached. Scholars would need another century to build a vocabulary for that kind of invisible cargo. The frontier already ran on it, the way it ran on seed grain and credit. Every practiced gathering the family had sat through beside Plum Creek was, without anyone intending it, a rehearsal for the surveyor's house. A language learned quietly at home turns out, one surprising morning, to work in any country that speaks it. And this is the quiet correction the whole evening has been building toward, the one worth carrying into sleep. The frontier of the storybooks is settled by lone hands, and institutions ride in late, once the excitement is over, to tax it and tame it and fence it. The church history of these two little towns runs the other way around. The institution walked in with the settlers, and sometimes a step ahead of them. It slept in their houses because it had nowhere else to sleep. It borrowed their kettles and their kitchen chairs. The famously self-reliant family of the novels spent those years inside a web of societies, superintendents, appointments, and travelling ministers. The family was itself a load-bearing strand of that web. They hosted the first Dakota services just 6 years after standing among the Minnesota founders. None of that diminishes them. It locates them. Self-reliance built the claim shanty and broke the sod. Mutual reliance built everything the shanties eventually added up to, which is to say, it built the town. So the field is planted, and the planter has gone north to his mailbag, and a new name, Brown, waits just outside the story with organisation papers in his coat pocket. Ahead of us lies a June morning in a railroad depot and a famous cousin out of the abolition years. Ahead lies a certificate from the territorial secretary, and a winter so hard it stopped the trains and came for the town's own pantry. The house by the lake grows dim now, stove ticking, lamp low. Let the lamp down easy. Let the night roll us gently on toward June. June now. Hold the change of light in mind. The last time the story paused, the prairie was still mostly winter and mostly empty, and the only congregation for miles fit around a supper table. By the first weeks of summer in 1880, the railroad had caught up with its own surveyors. A town was assembling itself at Smet the way prairie towns did, in weeks, out of fresh lumber and freight. Where the family had wintered alone, there were now streets being named, lots being argued over, and hammers going from first light until supper. A settlement can be sudden the way weather is sudden. This one was. New buildings meant new rooms. New rooms meant the little gathering could finally move out of the kitchen. And a new minister, the one the record handed us in 2 different months, was about to give the congregation something it had never yet possessed in either territory of its life. A legal shape, papers, a name that could be written into the files of a government. The homely part of our story is over for a while. The clerical part begins now, and it begins, of all the places a town offers, at the depot. In June of 1880, Reverend Edwin Brown organised the Congregational church at Smet, and he did it with services held in the railroad depot. Sit with the picture for a moment, because it is the whole frontier in one image. A depot is the least sentimental building a town owns. It exists to move grain, lumber, mail, and strangers on a schedule set hundreds of miles away. It smells of tar, sawdust, and paperwork. Its benches are built for waiting, not for lingering, and its clock is the one clock in town that answers to somewhere else. And that is where the congregation took its formal shape, in the railroad's own public room, with the railroad's business standing all around it. Not the surveyor's house this time. That borrowed kitchen belonged to the winter, and to the man whose road led away toward Athol. Summer had given the gathering a bigger borrowed room, and the gathering took it, the way it took every room this story has offered. This was Brown's work, the organising, the second act of institution building. He did it inside the machinery of the railroad itself, as if the church and the railroad had agreed to share the same front door. In a sense, they had been sharing one since February. The agreement was simply moving to bigger rooms as the town's rooms grew. Notice that the church has now met in two buildings and owned neither. First a surveying office, then a depot. Both belonged to the railroad. Both had other work to do all week. There is something almost parasitic about it, in the gentlest botanical sense, the way a vine climbs whatever trellis is nearest. The congregation used the railroad's rooms because the railroad, in a town this new, owned nearly every room worth using. That is not a criticism of either party. It is what scarcity looks like from the inside, one good roof doing the work of 5. But look closer, and the arrangement runs both ways. A railroad could lay a town out on paper and sell the lots. It could not make strangers into neighbours. No company on earth has ever managed to sell that particular product, and no town has ever stood long without it. The gatherings did that, one Sunday at a time, in the railroad's own buildings, and the railroad got a settled, rooted, staying sort of town out of the bargain. Neither party ever signed that agreement. Both parties kept it, year after year, room after room, without a word of it appearing in any ledger either of them maintained. And mark the difference between the two ministers' verbs, because the story has been careful with them. Alden held services. Brown organised a church. Holding a service requires a morning, a voice, and a room. Organising requires machinery. There are questions of membership to settle, officers to elect, a denomination's forms to follow, records to open and keep. Somebody must be authorised to speak for the body. Somebody must be trusted to hold what it owns. The work is dull on purpose, because dullness is what survives. It is the difference between lighting a fire and building a stove. A fire warms the people standing at it that evening. A stove goes on warming people who have not arrived yet, which is the entire point of an institution. The seam in the record, May on one page and September on the other, sits exactly across this handoff, and it matters not at all to what happened in June. Whoever still formally held the field that month, it was Brown who did the organising, Brown whose name attaches to the depot services, and Brown who would carry the congregation for years afterward. The planter had planted. The fencer was fencing. Every organised church begins with a list, and lists are where history gets personal. Constitutions are abstract. Bylaws are furniture. Roles are names, and names have faces. And some of the faces on this particular roll are faces the whole world would come to know from a set of beloved books. The June organising put actual signatures where our story has so far had only households and habits. The roll from that depot summer is short. It can be read slowly, name by name, like the cast list it is, and it deserves to be. Here is the charter membership of the Congregational Church of Smet, as the record preserves it, and it asked to be read the way it was written, formally a household at a time. Mr. and Mrs. C.P. Ingalls, Mary Ingalls, the eldest daughter, Reverend and Mrs. Edward Brown, Mr. and Mrs. S.N. Gilbert, and Vischer V. Barnes. That is the whole founding roll, a few households gathered out of a town that was itself only weeks old. No merchants of note, no railroad officials, farm families and a minister's household, the sort of names that anchor a county history rather than headline it. One more line completes the picture. When the offices were filled, Charles Ingalls was elected trustee, charged with the practical keeping of a church that as yet had nothing to keep. No building, no bell, no treasury to speak of. The farmer from Plum Creek, the man of the boot money, now held office in a congregation that met beside a freight scale. His wife stood on the roll beside him. So did Mary, the eldest daughter, her own name standing on the roll in her own right, which is its own quiet sentence about who belonged in a founding. Read as sociology, the roll is a marvel of smallness. 3 or 4 households, in a town of tents and half-built storefronts, signing themselves into an institution designed to outlive them all. Nobody on that list could know whether Smet itself would last 5 years. Towns along New Track failed all the time and took their churches down with them. Signing anyway was a bet, the same bet the mission system had been making from the other direction. The society bet a minister on the town. These families bet their names on the society. Neither side could see the other's cards, and the stake on both sides was years of patient work that a single bad harvest or a rerouted line could erase. And notice who the names were, not speculators passing through. A boomtown is mostly arrivals and departures, and nobody merely passing through signs a church roll. The signers were the stayers, the households already practicing winter out there, which is to say, the people who needed the institution to be real. A church roll in a boomtown is a reverse census. It counts, almost perfectly, the people who intend to still be present when the boom is over. For the family at the centre of our story, the June signing closed a 6-year circle with a quiet click. At Walnut Grove they had arrived to find a society already forming and joined it. Here there was nothing to join until they helped constitute it. Guests in Minnesota, founders in Dakota. The distance between those two words is the real distance the family had travelled, and it is measured in standing rather than miles, and the trusteeship matters more than its plain title suggests. A trustee is the person a congregation designates to touch its worldly things, its property, its accounts, its contracts. Electing Charles Ingalls trustee meant the handful of signers looked around the depot and chose the homesteader to hold the institution's earthly side. The man who had once given his boot money to another congregation's bell was now the keeper of this one's goods, before it had goods. Trust. Extended on credit, like everything else in a new town. The lumber was on credit. The harvests were on credit. It would have been strange if the offices were not. A roll of names in a depot is still only a private promise. To become a public fact, a church in Dakota Territory needed one more thing. It needed a piece of paper from the capital. The paper took its own slow road through the machinery of government, and the congregation simply went on meeting without it, the way it had gone on meeting without everything else. The paper came in November. That month, a certificate of organisation was issued to the First Congregational Church of Smet by the Secretary of Dakota Territory. With it, the depot gathering acquired its full legal name. It acquired standing in the files of a government. November of 1880, mind, not later, whatever fog sits over other dates in this story. Think of the distances inside that sentence. A handful of signatures from a June morning travelled down to the territorial capital. What came back, in the government's own time, was recognition that the First Congregational Church of Smet existed in the eyes of Dakota. The town was months old. Its church now had a government paper older than most of its storefronts. There is a comedy in that, and also a deep frontier logic, because paper was the one building material that could be manufactured faster than the town itself. On the open prairie, where nothing yet cast a shadow taller than a boxcar, that was what permanence looked like, a line in a distant ledger. Wind could take a roof, and fire could take a block of storefronts, and both eventually would take their turns at towns like this. A certificate in the capital's files sat beyond the reach of weather, so run the inventory at the end of 1880 because it is wonderfully lopsided. The First Congregational Church of Smet possessed a legal name, a territorial certificate, a charter roll, an elected trustee, and a pastor. It possessed no building, no bell, no land, and no furniture it could call its own. Everything the law recognises, it had. Everything a passerby could photograph, it lacked. A traveller stepping off the train that December could have attended its services and still gone home honestly reporting that Smet had no church to see. We have been watching this inversion all night in different clothes. The church before the town, the sermon before the appointment, now the certificate before the walls. Each time the invisible half of an institution arrives first, and the visible half follows at the speed of money and freight, which on the prairie was never fast. Institutions on the frontier were built soul first and body later, exactly backward from the way their eastern cousins remembered their own beginnings. The paradox held one more winter of borrowed rooms in it. Lumber would come. It had not come yet. Before winter closes over the story, meet the pastor properly. We have called him Brown, the fencer, the organiser, and let him work 2 paragraphs without a past. But the man who filed that congregation into existence deserves more than a verb. He was 65 years old that summer, Connecticut born, at an age when most ministers were easing toward a settled retirement rather than a raw territory. And he carried one of the most explosive surnames in America, and carried it honestly by blood. The record on this point is not folklore, it is genealogy. Edward Brown was born on the 1st of November 1814 in Colebrook, Connecticut, and he was a first cousin of John Brown, the abolitionist, the most argued over name of the generation before, a name that split the country wherever it was spoken. The connection is documented in the plainest way genealogy allows. Both men were grandsons of the same Captain John Brown, born back in 1728. This is not a family legend that grew in the telling, the way famous kinships often do in small towns. It is a recorded kinship, grandfather to grandsons, preserved in the annotation record beside the church history, as plain as a line in a parish register. So the minister standing in the Smet depot in June of 1880, patiently filling out a denomination's forms, shared a grandfather with the most famous abolitionist in American memory, the quiet cousin and the thunderous one, 2 branches of one Connecticut family, 2 entirely different answers to the same century. Nobody in the depot needed the connection explained. The name explained itself, the way certain names do, and then the forms went on being filled out. Weigh what that name meant in 1880. The war was 15 years finished, and every adult in the depot had lived through it. John Brown was not a distant historical figure to them. He was within living argument, a name some in any room would bless and others would curse, out of the great fight over slavery that had run into the war. Veterans of that war were homesteading all around Smet, men in their 30s and 40s with the whole thing still in their bodies. His cousin Edward had spent those same decades in the ministry, and now, in his middle 60s, was gathering a Prairie congregation numbered in single households. One cousin's name went ringing into the country's history, argued about from that day to this. The other spent a long life on the patient side of the same moral tradition, the pulpits and the mission fields, and became a line in a county history. Nobody sings about certificates of organisation. Towns are built out of them all the same. Fame ran entirely to one branch. The work, the daily institutional work that actually holds towns together, ran to the other, and there is a fit, almost too neat to be designed, between that ancestry and this channel's whole subject. History keeps 2 registers, a loud one, of speeches and battles and names that reach the textbooks, and a quiet one, of certificates, rolls, barrels, and borrowed rooms. The Brown family happened to supply a famous entry to each. Our story lives in the quiet register on purpose. That is the channel's whole wager, that the certificates and the barrels hold as much of the past as the raids do, and put an audience to sleep far more kindly. And here the 2 registers touch, cousin to cousin, so we can see they were never really separate. The same century that produced the famous cousin's thunder also produced the machinery that put a minister in a Dakota depot with organisation forms in his bag. Both were answers to the question of what a conscience owes its neighbours. One answer blazed up fast and has been argued about ever since. The other took the rest of a long life, filed its paperwork on time, and asked for no argument at all. The country needed to settle which answer it could live with. The Prairie, meanwhile, simply needed the paperwork done. That was the summer and autumn of 1880. Certificate in the files, pastor at the depot, town growing louder by the week. The little institution had every reason to expect an ordinary first winter, the kind its Minnesota elder had weathered by the stove. It did not get one. What came next did not care about any of it. The winter that arrived that year would become the measuring stick every later Dakota winter was held against. Trains stopped. Coal and flour and mail stopped with them. Whole towns along the line spent months sealed off behind the drifts, stretching whatever was already inside the snow line. And our little congregation story runs straight through that winter, packed inside a wooden barrel that could not get through the snow. The winter of 1880 and 81 shut the railroad down. Snow filled the cuts faster than crews could clear them, and with the train stopped, all freight stopped, and with all freight, the Christmas barrel. The barrel that should have reached the family for the holiday sat blocked somewhere down the line, month after month, while the town it was addressed to made a hard winter last on what it already had. Nobody in Smet could hurry it. Nobody east of the snow could either. It was freight, and freight moves when trains move, and no train moved. Trains did not run again until the middle of May, 1881. Think of that span against the church's own short life. The blockade lasted longer than the interval between the Leap Day service and the June organising. The congregation had been severed from its web for about as long as it had formerly existed, and even then the barrel had to wait its turn, because months of stranded freight came pouring up the line at once, and a church barrel does not outrank seed wheat and stoves. It finally arrived at about the 1st of June, 1881. Count the distance on the calendar. A Christmas shipment delivered as summer began, roughly half a year late, having crossed the last stretch of its journey at the speed of a thaw. See what that blockade did to everything this story has built. The church at Smet was a rail-borne institution to its bones. Its minister had come out along the line, as ministers in this country did. Its services met in railroad buildings, first the office and then the depot. Its certificate had travelled to the capital and back as mail. And its material kindnesses, the goods and gifts of the wider aid network, moved as freight, packed into barrels somewhere east and rolled west on the same cars as everything else. When the snow won, all of it stopped together. For those months the congregation was thrown back on exactly what it had possessed on Leap Day morning, which is to say, people in a room. The certificate went on existing in the capital's files, doing nothing. The society's ledgers went on carrying the mission, reaching nobody. Paper institutions kept perfectly well in the cold. They simply could not help. No mail from the society, no barrel, no connection to the web that had planted it. The web did not break, mind. It simply froze, like everything else, and the town had to live on what assembly alone could provide until the thaw. There is a plain lesson in logistics hiding in the church barrel's travel dates, and it is worth saying gently the way the Prairie taught it. Institutions are promises, and promises travel on infrastructure. Take the rails away and the promises do not dissolve. They stack up at the break in the line, patient as freight, waiting for the way through to reopen. The certificate could not have existed without the mail. The pastor could not have arrived without the line. Generosity itself, the warmest and most human strand of the whole web, moved at exactly the speed of a freight schedule and not 1 mile faster. When the schedule failed, generosity did not fail, but it waited, boxed and addressed, on a siding under snow. The winter did not test whether people cared. It tested whether caring could get through, and for about half a year the honest answer was no. That distinction is easy to miss in warm houses, and impossible to miss in cold ones. Every institution the family had helped build stood intact through that winter, intact and out of reach. Then the thaw, the middle of May, the first trains and the great backed-up river of freight moving again, car by car, siding by siding. Somewhere in that river, low in the manifest beneath the seed wheat and the stoves and the lumber, the whole line was screaming for, one barrel with a family's name on it, worked its way north and west toward a town that had stopped expecting it. Freight has no sense of occasion. It arrives when it arrives, and it does not know what it is carrying. The men working the yards that spring moved a legend through their hands and logged it as a barrel. What happened when it arrived is the gentlest scene in this whole history. When the barrel finally came, the family did not quietly unpack it and move on with the summer. They held Christmas. The delayed Christmas dinner went onto the table with a turkey at the centre of it, in June, with the prairie green outside the windows. They shared the table with the Boast family, the neighbours the record places at that dinner. The occasion comes down to us remembered as a happy reunion. Every word of that sentence is doing quiet work. A turkey after a winter of rationed wheat. A dinner, not a mere delivery. Guests invited to share out of a barrel that had taken half a year to arrive. The calendar said summer. The table said Christmas. 6 months of waiting were served along with the turkey and eaten gladly. And the family, who had every practical reason to treat the barrel as overdue supplies, treated it instead as the holiday itself, held in trust, celebrated the week it became possible. Christmas in June sounds like whimsy until you see it as bookkeeping. The winter had suspended the holiday the way the snow had suspended the trains, and the family carried it forward on the books, unpaid but not cancelled, until delivery resumed. Anyone can keep a holiday on its date. Keeping one across a half year of hunger and then honouring it in full is a sterner kind of celebration. Holding the dinner late with guests meant refusing to let the blockade decide which promises lapsed. It also restored in one afternoon nearly every strand the winter had cut. Goods from the east on the table, neighbours gathered around it, the aid network's kindness, delivered and answered with hospitality, thanks given over a meal. The scene is small, one table in one claim house on the Dakota Prairie. Nothing about it would make a newspaper, then or ever. It makes something better than a newspaper now. It makes a fixed, dated or documented point of gladness in a record that is mostly weather and work. But it is the same picture this story has drawn in a kitchen and a depot, the institution reassembling itself the moment reassembly became possible, using whatever the calendar happened to offer. The season was wrong. The gathering was exactly right. Set this June table beside a December evening the story already holds. At Walnut Grove, in 1875, the church dedication came with a Christmas tree, and gifts reached a grasshopper-ruined settlement right at the season's proper date. That was generosity arriving during the crisis, on time, under a new church roof. The June dinner of 1881 is the same kindness with the seasons reversed. The crisis had already passed. The trains had failed for months, and the gift, when it finally crossed the last miles, arrived after the need was over, into the green wrong end of the calendar. The family kept it anyway, held it, staged it, shared it. Same family, 6 winters apart, standing at both ends of the aid network's reach. In one scene they receive alongside a whole settlement, in the other they host, and the sharing runs outward from their own table. Once as parishioners under a decorated tree, once as hosts around a thawed-out barrel, and in both rooms the point was never the goods. It was that somebody far away had packed them. Distance is what makes a gift into evidence. Anyone can be kind across a fence. Kindness that crosses half a country, twice, 6 years apart, is a system working. The reverse seasons teach something the tidy version misses. Generosity that arrives during the emergency is easy to understand. It answers need with supply, like water on fire. Generosity that arrives after the emergency looks, on paper, wasted. The winter was survived without the barrel. Every practical purpose it might have served had already been met by endurance, and yet nobody in that claim house seems to have felt they were unpacking a redundancy. The late gift carried the one cargo that does not spoil on a siding. It carried the news that the web still held. A town half a continent's postage away had stayed on somebody's list, through a winter that erased schedules entirely. Supplies answer need, faithfulness answers doubt, and doubt is the deeper hunger of the two and the slower one to refill. In June, with the pantry question easing at last, it was the second answer the family set the table for. They fed it to their guests as turkey, with the windows open on a green world that had so recently tried to starve them. Now step all the way back, the way we do when a stretch of the story completes itself, and count what 18 months had done. February of 1880, a sermon in a borrowed kitchen for one household. June, a charter in a depot, names on a roll, a trustee elected. November, a certificate in the territorial files. Then a winter that cut every thread, and a June that retied them around a dinner table. The congregation comes out of those 18 months holding a legal name, a pastor with a famous grandfather, officers and files. It holds a tested aid network, and it holds proof now that it could survive being completely severed from all of it. What it still does not have, after everything, is the one thing a stranger would look for first: a church. A building with its name on it, a roofline on the flat horizon, a door that is nobody's kitchen door and nobody's freight room. The gathering habit behind it is 2 territories and 7 years old. The Smet congregation that habit built has never once met under a roof it owned. The soul of the institution is finished. The body has not yet been started, and the lumber for it is going to have to come up the same thawed line the barrel did. And lumber is exactly where the story goes next. Building funds and subscription lists, a shell of a church raised against a January sky, the trustee with a hammer in his hand, a pulpit that Brown would keep for years until an autumn resignation, a wedding held quietly in a pastor's home, and far back east, a bell that still had one more surprise to give. The night is deep now, and the hard winter is behind us for good, and everything left to build gets built in gentler weather, by people we already know, with money raised a few dollars at a time. Ease down into the pillow, and let the story raise the walls without you. Gentler weather now, in the story and in the room where it is being told. The blockade winter is behind the town for good. The June table has been cleared, and what remains of our night is the part every early chapter has been quietly promising. The building of a building, the keeping of a pastor, and then the letting of him go. A wedding, and after the wedding, the long afterlives, which are the part of any true story that the storybooks leave out and the quiet files keep best. Nothing violent is coming, and nothing sad arrives before its proper year. Rest easy on that. From here to the end, the story is all patient carpentry, in wood and in people, the kind of work that makes a good last hour for a long night. Settle as deep as the pillow allows, and let the last hour be the easiest one. The congregation that has borrowed every room it ever used is about to get walls of its own, and the family at the centre of our night is going to help raise them. After that come the partings, each in its season, and after the partings, the surprising list of things that refuse to end, which is the list this channel loves best. Through 1881, the congregation raised building funds. That is a single plain sentence, and underneath it sits a year of small work. How the fund was gathered, entry by entry. The surviving account does not itemize, and it does not need to. A building fund in a town 2 years old could only grow the way such funds grew everywhere on the young Prairie, in gift size to harvests and wages, saved patiently against lumber prices. A fund like that grows the way a snowbank grows, one quiet addition at a time, until one day it is tall enough to matter. And the saving worked. During January of 1882, the shell of the new church stood complete at Smet. Note the honest word, because the honest word is doing honest work. The shell. Walls raised, roof closed, a building's outline standing against the winter sky, with everything inside it still to come. Floors, plaster, pews, a stove, all of it waited on further funds and warmer months. But an outline against the sky was already the tallest promise the congregation had ever made. And one more detail comes down with the date, one this story has been waiting a long time to hear. Charles Ingalls helped build the structure, not as architect, not as contractor, nothing so grand. He was one of the men whose hands put it up. The trustee elected in a depot 18 months earlier now had sawdust on his sleeves from the body of the institution he'd been trusted to keep. The office had finally acquired its full meaning. Keeper of goods, and maker of them too. Hold the picture of that January outline for a moment, because the whole story stands inside it. For 2 years this congregation had been a soul without a body, a certificate in a file, a roll in a book, services moving from a kitchen to a depot like a family with no lease. Its entire physical existence could still be packed into a satchel and carried at a walk. Now it had a fixed address and a roofline. A stranger arriving by train could finally point at something and say, "There, that is the Congregational Church." Pointing is a small dignity. Institutions wait years for it. Now, for the first time since the leap day, there was a shape on the horizon that meant church and meant nothing else. A shell is an unfinished thing, and that is exactly why it is the right emblem. The town could see the institution now, but the institution was still mostly promise, still waiting on floors and pews and plaster, still more intention than furniture. That did not matter to anyone watching from the road. What a town needs from a church shell in January is not comfort. It is proof of intent, standing where weather can test it. Buildings begin as faith made visible. Finishing them is just the long argument between that faith and the price of lumber. The argument would run on for a while yet. But from that January forward, anyone passing on the road could see which way it was going to end. And look at who swung the hammers that winter. The record singles out the Trustee, and the detail closes a circle the story drew in its first hour. In Minnesota, this same man's gift to a church had been money, $3 that had been meant for his own boots. In Dakota, the gift shows up in the Register of Labor, in the plain phrase "helped build." The same giving, translated into the currency the moment could afford. There is a whole theory of the frontier in that translation, and it deserves one drowsy minute of daylight. Settlements ran on what economists would later call in-kind contribution, and what the people themselves called helping. Cash was the scarcest crop on the prairie. Time, muscle, and skill were the abundant ones, and every institution that wanted building learned to be paid in them. A man who could not spare much cash could spare his hands. The building rose out of exactly such sparings, gift by gift. It rose the way the fund had risen through the year before, dollar by dollar, nobody's fortune and everybody's margin. Add the two columns together and you get a church. There is no third column. Every steeple the frontier ever raised stands on some local mixture of those two ledgers, coins and days, and the mixture into Smet leaned the way it always leaned in young towns, heavily toward days. So the body was rising at last, board by board, subscription by subscription. The soul, meanwhile, had been in the keeping of one man for the whole run of the story's Dakota years, and his part of the tale was quietly approaching its end. Every founding era closes. The good ones close gently. This one closed the way it had run, with paperwork on a dated autumn day, and with the work finished enough to hand on. Edward Brown served as minister of the First Congregational Church of Smet from 1880 to 1884. Say the span slowly and it sounds modest. Live it and it was everything. 4 years, running from the depot summer through the certificate, through the blockade winter, through the fundraising, to a church with walls. Short as pastorates go and completely decisive. Everything a congregation needs once and only once happened on his watch. Then he stepped down, and the moment keeps its exact administrative shape in the church's own files. His resignation became official on October 26, 1884. An exact date, a Sunday-adjacent piece of church business handled in due form, entered into the minutes the way everything in his tenure had been entered. Count his age against that date gently, the way the night invites. The man had come to the raw town site at 65, an age when the century expected its ministers to be finishing, not founding. He laid down the pulpit just short of 70. The years in between were the entire founding era of the congregation. They were also, for a man of his years, plainly the crowning project of a long working life, though nobody in Smet would have put it that way. That life ended its working chapter here, on the far side of everything, with a church standing where there had been grass. Measure the tenure by what it contained rather than what it lasted. When Brown took the field, the congregation was a leap day memory and a handful of households meeting wherever the railroad allowed. When he set it down, the congregation had a legal name, territorial papers, officers, a survived catastrophe, and a building of its own rising in town. It had weathered its infancy, which is the season that kills institutions, the way the first winter is the season that kills orchards. That is a founding compressed into a single term of service, a whole institutional childhood passed inside one pastorate. The fencer had finished the fence, gate, posts and all, and the quiet dignity of an official resignation, dated and entered in due form, is itself part of the story's pattern. Consider how few frontier stories end with paperwork completed properly. Ventures collapsed, partners scattered, towns emptied between census years. A founding that closes its own books cleanly is rare enough to admire on those grounds alone. Institutions that begin properly also end their chapters properly. No drama and no rupture worth anyone's ink. A nearly 70-year-old minister concluded his work in the correct denominational form. He had begun it the same way in a depot, with the correct denominational forms 4 years and one entire town earlier. But a pastor who resigns does not vanish from a town the size of Smet. Retirement in a small settlement is a change of duties, not a disappearance. Brown's largest remaining service to this story was still ahead of him when he stepped down. To see it coming, meet the member of his household who stood closest to the family we have followed all night. She has been waiting patiently at the edge of the story, and her friendship is the thread the last knot will be tied with. Small histories are like small towns. Everyone turns out to be connected to everyone, and the connections do the plot's real work. Her name was Ida Bell Wright, and she was Brown's adopted daughter, adopted into his household before June of 1870, years before any of them saw Dakota. By the de Smet years, she was a young woman of the minister's household, present in the same small rooms this story has been sitting in all night. The old pages are particular on the point. Adopted, not born to them, a daughter by decision rather than by blood, and a daughter entirely in every way that mattered to the household, and her place in our story is stated just as plainly. Ida was Laura Ingalls' close friend, not an acquaintance, not a pew neighbour, a close friend, in a town young enough that friendships were still infrastructure. Think of what that pairing means for everything this night has followed. The trustee's daughter and the pastor's daughter, close friends in a town their own families had helped constitute. They'd grown up inside the same young institution, 2 girls for whom the depot services and the new-built church were simply the furniture of childhood. The institutional bond between the 2 households, minister and trustee, role and pulpit, had grown a personal strand, the kind that never appears in certificates and outlasts most of what does. Institutions look like machinery from the outside, all offices and minutes and dated resignations. From the inside they feel like this: 2 girls, friends, whose fathers happen to hold the church's 2 kinds of authority, the spiritual and the practical. Neither girl chose the institution. Both received a friendship from it, which is the kind of dividend no charter ever promises. Read every founding document this story has touched, the society minutes, the certificate, the roll. Not one of them mentions company. Company is what they were all for. The documents built the container, the friendships were the contents, and the contents were always the point. The friendship did not run through the institution exactly. It ran through the life the institution made possible. Sundays, socials, the ordinary adjacency of a small congregation. The family's whole church story had run through kitchens and depots and borrowed rooms, and the friendship ran through the same doors. By now the pattern should feel familiar. Wherever this story looks for an institution, it finds people who chose each other, and wherever it looks closely at the people, it finds the institution quietly holding the room they chose each other in. Now, the date this whole closing movement has been walking toward, the one the famous series itself closes on, August 25th, 1885. On that day, Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder were married, and the ceremony took place at Reverend Brown's home. Not in the church, not under the roof her father had helped raise, in the minister's own house, before the man who had organised her family's congregation and signed the roll beside them. The scene stays small in every telling. A quiet day, a minister's home, vows said plainly, and a marriage begun, with the parties the certificate itself would name, and no crowd the sources care to count. Read that again, gently, because the story's last great irony lives inside it. The bride's family had stood on the charter roll. Her father had been trustee and had helped raise the building itself, and when the church's most famous daughter married, she married in a house, before the retired minister, in the same domestic register where her family's whole religious life had always actually lived. The book tradition adds one detail the church files do not carry, and it belongs to the books, so we will hand it to them by name. In the novel's telling, the bride asked that the word obey be left out of her vows, and the old minister obliged her. Whether the parlour conversation ran exactly that way, the files cannot confirm. The books say it did, and the books get to keep their own scene. A wedding in a house by the church's founding minister 1 year after his retirement. Every thread of the night meets in that room, and they meet quietly, the way threads do when the weaving is nearly done. The congregation began in a dwelling, because there was nowhere else. It married off its best remembered daughter in a dwelling, though by then there was somewhere else. A real church with real walls that her own father had helped raise. Whatever the practical reasons and the old pages do not give them, the shape is perfect, the kind of shape a novelist would not dare invent. This story has argued from its first hour, in a kitchen, in a depot, and under an unfinished roof, that the church of these two towns was never fundamentally a building. It was a set of people and promises that could operate anywhere. It proved that one final time in August of 1885, in a parlour, with the old fencer presiding. And the word obey, if the books are to be believed, was gently left lying outside the door. And with that ceremony, the era our episode was built to hold comes quietly to its close. 11 years, 2 territories, and one family's passage from newcomers at a Minnesota society to founders, officers, builders, and finally a bride at the centre of a Dakota congregation story. Every stage of that passage happened inside the same institution, wearing different rooms. First it lent them a congregation, then it lent them standing. In the end it lent them the parlour the whole era closed in. The little house years end here, at the threshold of a marriage, the way the books end too, with the daughter becoming a wife and a new claim shanty waiting on another quarter section. But the paper trail does not stop where books stop. Paper trails never do. Everyone in that parlour kept living. The institutions they built kept standing, and the story owes its last few minutes to what became of them all, because Afterlives are where a history proves what it was really made of. So, softly now, the Afterlives, one by one, taken the way a caretaker walks a sleeping house at night, checking each room and closing each door with care. The minister first, then the building, then a letter in a sister's hand, then last of all the bell. 4 rooms, 4 small lamps to put out, and the story is done. Take them at a walk. Nothing in this last stretch hurries, and neither will we. Edward Brown lived another decade past the wedding he performed. He died on March 23, 1895, and the circumstance that comes down with the date is a tender one. He was in Wisconsin when death came, visiting Ida, the adopted daughter whose friendship with the bride had knit the two households together. He was 80 years old, and he was, at the end, exactly where this story would have guessed, in a family member's house. Institutions of one kind or another had housed him all his life, and then he came home to the town he had organised for burial. Brown is buried into Smet Cemetery, in the ground of the settlement he had filed into institutional existence 15 years before. The man had spent a long life in many places. Connecticut-born, 80 years along, family roots tangled with the most famous abolitionist name in the country. Of all the places a long life touches, the one that keeps him is the little Dakota town from its last working chapter, the place that had needed everything and received 4 years of him. There is a quiet symmetry in where he ended. A founding minister could be buried back east among the settled churches of his training, and no one would think it strange. Brown lies instead inside his own last work. The cemetery plot is a kind of membership, the most permanent kind a town offers, and it makes the fencer a part of the field forever. De Smet keeps its organiser the way the roll keeps its names, permanently, in its own ground, in writing. He organised his own permanence without meaning to. Membership, it turns out, was the one thing he never resigned. He was 65 when he arrived, an organiser of one small congregation among the thousands the century planted. He is remembered tonight not because he sought remembering. He is remembered because the families he served included one that would later be written onto the country's bedtime shelves. Fame, as this story keeps finding, attaches where it pleases. The work stands where it was done. A visitor walking to Smet Cemetery today walks past the resting organiser of the town's first institution, and most visitors walk past without knowing it, which is exactly the proportion of fame to work this whole history has taught us to expect. The building outlived its builder's era too, and it did not stand still. The first De Smet church building passed in later years to another body of worshippers, the Christian and Missionary Alliance Congregation, and in 1909 it was greatly enlarged, with another wing added onto the original structure. Hold both halves of that sentence, because both halves matter to how this story ends. The shell that Charles Ingalls helped raise was neither torn down in the family's own era, nor frozen in place as a relic. It kept working, which is the best fate a working building can have. New hands, a new congregation's name on it, more room grafted onto the old frame as the town's needs grew. Buildings on the prairie either worked or vanished. Nobody out there kept an idle structure for sentiment, and so the surest sign a building was loved is that it was used, altered and enlarged. A quarter century after the trustee swung his hammer, the walls he helped set were still doing the only thing walls are for, which is holding a gathering out of the weather. Different name on the door by then, same shelter inside it. Buildings are the least loyal part of any institution, and the most honest. They serve whoever gathers. No wall ever checked a membership roll. A roof shelters the congregation it has, not the one that raised it. The congregation that raised this one eventually moved along its own history, and the structure simply went on being useful to the next set of neighbours under a different name. Some might read that as loss. The story we have been telling reads it the other way. The whole point of the shell, back in that January, was never the name on it. It was shelter for assembly, the scarce thing the whole frontier lacked. Shelter for assembly is exactly what it kept providing, enlarged, renamed, and still standing past the era of everyone who first paid for it. The gift outgrew the givers. Good gifts generally do. It is the failed gifts that stay exactly the size their givers made them. Now, the letter. In 1930, Carrie Ingalls Swansea, the younger sister who had been a small girl through the De Smet founding years, set down her memories of the town's early services. Her letter survives, and it preserves the one thing minutes and certificates never catch, which is what the room actually felt like to a child sitting in it. 50 years after the fact, a grown woman picked up a pen, and the first thing that came back to her across all that distance of time, ahead of every solemn thing she might have chosen, was this. She remembered the children jumping between the benches. She remembered a scolding for it from Reverend Woodworth, one of the ministers of those early years. Benches mined, not pews. The word alone dates the memory to the borrowed room era, before the building, when the seating was whatever the room already owned. That is the whole treasure. Not doctrine, not dates. Children misbehaving in a plain room, and an adult calling them to order, half a century before she wrote it down, and a full century and a half before tonight. Every solemn institution in this story had children squirming in it somewhere. Only a sister thought that fact worth saving, and she saved it in the one form history cannot argue with, which is the memory of someone who was small enough to be scolded. 50 years is a long way to carry a memory, and it is worth noticing what made the trip. Not the sermons, not a single word of them, not a text, not a hymn number. What survived was benches, jumping, and a scolding, the bodily comedy of childhood inside the solemn machine. Historians treat recollections like that carefully, as this story does, because memory half a century old is a witness speaking, not a transcript. But notice what the detail proves without any need for precision. The gatherings we have followed through kitchens and depots were full of children. The congregation was not an assembly of the devout elderly holding a line. It was households, whole ones, noise included, and its early rooms rang with exactly the sound a real future makes. The solemn adults of 1880 are beyond our thanks. The jumping children grew up to write the letters, and one of them grew up to write the books that carried the whole quiet story out into the world's bedtime hours. A church with jumping children in it is a church that is going to still exist in 50 years, when one of the jumpers writes it all down. One room left to check before the lamp goes out, and it is not in Dakota at all. For the last stop of the night, the story goes back where it began, back east across the prairie, into Minnesota, to the little town on Plum Creek. Back to the first gift of the whole evening, the one that has been waiting since the opening minutes for its answer. The bell is still there. Sit with that plain sentence for a breath, because it has crossed a century and a half to be said tonight. It is the bell of 1874, raised by the Union Congregational Society in the year of its founding. It is the one a cash-poor farmer helped pay for with the $3 he had saved for boots, and it remains in service in Walnut Grove today. It hangs now at the English Lutheran Church in town, not in the original building, and the site history is careful about that, so we will be too. Different walls, different congregations' name at the door, the same bell, with the same voice it carried out of the founding year, and it still rings. It is not a museum piece behind glass and not a plaque. It is a working church bell. On ordinary mornings in this century, it does exactly what it was hung to do in that one. It tells a scattered town that it is time to gather. Every institution in this story has now outlived something. The congregation outlived the blockade. The building outlived its first congregation, and the bell has outlived all of it. The society that bought it, the walls that first held it, the man whose boot money helped hang it, and the century they all shared. Objects like that become accidental historians, and the bell is the best kind, because its way of remembering is audible. The bell does not commemorate the story, it continues it. Each time it sounds, the original transaction executes one more time, a call to assembly, paid for in advance by people long gone, honoured by walls they never saw. No contract on paper has ever been serviced so faithfully for so long, by so many parties who never met. Most monuments ask to be looked at. A working bell asks for what the gift always asked for, which is that the neighbours come. As long as it goes on asking, the $3 are still being spent, and the man who spent them is still, in the only sense that ever mattered to him, being heard from. So set the story's two great documents side by side one last time, the receipt and the roll. In 1874, in Minnesota, a farmer gave the $3 he had saved for his own boots toward a congregation's bell. 6 years later, in Dakota, the same man's name went onto a charter roll in a railroad depot, alongside his wife's name and his eldest daughter's, and the little company of signers elected him trustee. One man, paying twice for the same institution in the two currencies he ever had, first his boots and then his name. Minnesota took his money, Dakota took his signature, his trusteeship, and eventually his winter carpentry. He gave each place what that place's moment asked of him. That is the whole engine of this history, seen plain at last, with the night nearly over and no more mysteries left to hold back. The church that followed the Ingalls family west was not a building that chased them, and not an organisation that recruited them. It was a practice they carried, and it was paid for at every station by ordinary households handing over whatever they could spare. Money, labour, names, rooms, and Sundays. The payments went on until the practice had walls and a bell and a place in the files of 2 states, and that resolves the question the famous books leave so beautifully open. The novels give us a family that seems to need nothing but itself, and they are true to how survival felt. The records give us the same family constituting churches, hosting missionaries, holding offices, raising buildings, and being carried, in their worst winter, by an aid network that reached them the moment the snow allowed. Both pictures are honest, and neither is complete without the other. Self-reliance was real, and it was never alone. The family that could survive a blockade winter on its own endurance still signed rolls, still hosted ministers, still gave its boot money away. The claim shanty and the charter roll were built by the same hands in the same years, and the town that resulted needed both, the way a person needs both a spine and a family. One holds a body upright, the other makes being upright worth the trouble. What the quiet register adds to the loud legend is simply this: nobody homesteads alone. Not in Minnesota, not in Dakota, not anywhere the grass ran to the horizon. Not even the family whose aloneness became the most beloved story the Prairie ever produced. Run the final inventory of survivals slowly, item by item, because it is comforting, and comfort is the business of this hour of the night. The certificates institution carried on past its founders. The building Charles helped raise grew a wing and kept sheltering neighbours deep into the next century. A letter in a sister's handwriting keeps the sound of children in the early rooms. A grave in Smet keeps the organiser inside his own organisation. And a bell in Minnesota still rings out the original invitation on ordinary mornings. Not one of those survivals required anyone famous. Fame came later and landed on the family, and it is the reason tonight's episode exists. But every single survival on the list required only somebody ordinary giving something spareable at the right moment. That is what institutions are, seen from the quiet register. They are the sum of small gifts compounding. $3 compounds into a bell. A signature compounds into a church. A week of winter carpentry compounds into a building that shelters strangers in another century. The interest is still being paid tonight, in a town most of us will never visit every time the bell speaks. Compounding does not require witnesses. It only requires that nobody withdraws the principle, and nobody ever has. The night is nearly through now, and the story is fully told, from 3 saved dollars to a bell that never stopped answering for them. The family sleeps in history. The bell sleeps in its tower between mornings. The town sleeps around the cemetery where its first organizer rests. And somewhere in the files of 2 states, a society and a certificate go on quietly existing, requiring nothing of anyone. Let them all keep, each in its place, each in its season. Let the Prairie hold every one of its small documented kindnesses through the dark, and let the last sound of the episode be the one the story earned. A bell, far away, rung for neighbours. Thank you for spending this long night among the quiet builders, the boot money and the barrels, the borrowed rooms and the small signatures that turned out to hold. Good night.